Now, I am pleased to extend a warm invitation to Mr. Tim Gould, Chief Economist of the International Energy Agency, to deliver his address. This is the first time we are having the IEA speak at SMW, and it is truly an honor. Mr. Gould, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me, representing the International Energy Agency, to come and address this Singapore Maritime Week. It's a particularly important moment for the IEA's relationship with Singapore, because as our esteemed previous speaker mentioned, we are taking some important steps to strengthen the relationship that the International Energy Agency has with Southeast Asia and with Singapore, but also in the sector that we're talking about today. We have a lot of existing partnerships in the region, but later this year we'll be opening the first IEA regional center outside our headquarters in Paris, and it'll be here. And we look forward to strengthening the discussion on a whole range of energy topics with you all. But it was also mentioned the MOU that we are signing with the MPA, and we look forward very much to deepening that dialogue on the transition that we're going to talk about now, the energy transition, but also the transition in the shipping sector. And I'd like to start, for those of you who are not familiar with the International Energy Agency, a few words about what we do. Our founding mission 50 years ago, after the first oil shock, was around energy security, and energy security remains core to everything that we do. You can imagine that today, with the very fragile situation in the Middle East, we are watching closely developments there and the implications that they may have for energy markets. But that mandate has broadened beyond oil to other fuels, to electricity, now to clean energy supply chains, and all the modern areas of a well-functioning energy system. And I wanted to say a few words about where we are today in that transformation of the energy sector on which we have embarked, because it may not seem like it sometimes, but there are important things happening in the energy sector. Last year, we had an increase of well over 85% in the year-on-year deployment of solar PV around the world. We had a 60% increase in the amount of new wind capacity that was installed around the world. We had a large jump in electric mobility. The amount of cars sold, electric cars sold worldwide, increased by almost a third, so that almost 1 in 5 of every cars sold worldwide last year was electric. And all these trends are continuing into 2024 in the early data that we are collecting for this year. It's not all moving in that direction. Year-on-year deployment of heat pumps fell, largely because we had a decline last year in natural gas prices in many key markets around the world, notably in Europe, and that dampened the economic incentives to install heat pumps. So there is a very strong role for policy here to ensure that these trends are maintained. But there are structural changes underway in the energy sector. And I wanted to just take one part of this, the renewables part, and just to think through what, in our view, that situation might look like over the next 5 years as we move through the 2020s, bearing in mind also that at COP in Dubai at the end of last year, the nations of the world came together to target a tripling in renewable capacity by 2030. First thing to say, China in this discussion is on a different scale. So China accounts for more than half of the solar deployed around the world, nearly half the wind, more than half of the electric cars. And so when we think about deployment around the world, China is out in front by some distance. It's out in front in terms of deployment. It's also out in front in terms of the manufacturing of many of those clean energy technologies. But we are seeing increases in other major markets as well. The EU responding to the pressures that they had through the global energy crisis, the pressures in particular on natural gas markets to accelerate that pace of deployment. The United States with the Inflation Reduction Act offering additional momentum to renewable deployment in that market as well. India with a new program of auctions and measures to improve the financial health of the distribution companies sees a significant increase as well. And Brazil is leading that charge in Latin America. For the moment, ASEAN, Southeast Asia, is not a huge player in that market. Things are increasing, but it's a relatively small share of the total. And one of the areas that we'll be looking at very closely, working with countries across the region, is what it would take in terms of policies and working with financiers to accelerate that progress. But there's the global picture. If we end up with something like this, we would be on track for an increase of around 2.5 times in renewable capacity by the end of this decade. So not the 3 times, not the tripling, but not a million miles away from it. If we want to go faster, big questions about infrastructure. Grids are not in place everywhere they need to be to allow for the expansion of renewables at the pace we would need to see. And grids are becoming an obstacle to the expansion of renewables. And in many countries, including countries in this part of the world, there's a relatively high cost of capital for new clean energy projects, which makes it difficult to move ahead with relatively capital-intensive investments. But these structural changes, particularly in China, but not only in China, are starting to have implications for our view on the way that transitions play out. So China's been instrumental in driving all sorts of trends in the energy sector for decades, but in our view, that role of China in the energy system is changing, and that, together with structural changes in the advanced economies, continued growth in many other parts of the world, but the net effect is that by the end of this decade, in our view, you have a flattening or a mild peak, you could even say, in demand for all of the fossil fuels in a scenario that reflects today's policy settings. And that's the first time we've seen the end of an era of fossil fuel growth this decade in our outlook. There are many things that we know how to do. So there are many mature technologies that we need to scale up in order to move towards that net zero emissions future. But the effect of all of the changes I've described so far is to reach a peak in energy-related CO2 emissions by roughly the middle of this decade, and then a gradual decline through to 2050. That would be consistent with, by the end of this century, an increase of around 2.4, 2.5 degrees Celsius in global average temperatures relative to the pre-industrial age. That would not avoid very severe impacts from climate change. So the question that we have in this room, as in many other rooms, is what it would take to get us on a much steeper trajectory for emissions reductions and consistent with that 1.5 degree goal. Now, much of the stuff that we would need to do is well known. It's mature technologies. The policies are tried and tested. We have good examples from all around the world. But shipping, of course, is not one of those sectors. As we heard very well described in the last presentation, there are many uncertainties still. There are many issues of sequencing, of coordination, of technology choices, of innovation that would need to be resolved for us to move in that direction. And when we think about the respective roles of different types of technologies to get us to that net zero emissions picture, when we first did a net zero emissions by 2050 scenario back in 2021, almost half of the technologies that we needed were not yet market ready. So they were not commercially available. They were in a prototype or demonstration phase. That's a situation that you know very well. But when we updated this work last year, we found that innovation was working. So some of the things that we needed, some of the answers that we were looking for were coming through at commercial scale. So we had the first sodium-ion batteries, we had floating offshore wind, we had some of the big industrial solutions for the use of electrolytic hydrogen for steel production, for example. And so that uncertainty that we saw in 2021 has narrowed. So we know we have more of the answers now than we did a couple of years ago. But there are, of course, areas where we continue to need innovation, where we continue to need creativity. And the shipping sector is, of course, one of them. 2% of global energy-related CO2 emissions, but the trajectory that we see based on today's policy settings is a long way away from the ambition that's been set out in the IMO. So the question that we need to answer in this room is, what would it take? What mix of industry and policy and innovation actions would close that gap? I'm not going to go through in detail what the IEA vision for this is, as was very well described already. There's a lot of uncertainties over how this will play out. This is the way our current projections look for energy consumption from shipping in that 1.5 degree scenario. You need a very dramatic increase in the role of non-fossil fuels in such a scenario. You have relatively few transitions from oil to gas to a low emissions fuel. You need to be bringing these new solutions at scale into the market much earlier. I'm not going to insist on the split of technologies. That reflects many discussions that we have with practitioners in this sector, and it hopefully will reflect future discussions that we will have with the MPA and others. But one of the takeaways for us from this picture is when we talk to shipping, when we talk to the aviation sector, when we talk to some of the big industrial sectors, there's often a tendency for everyone to look at everyone else for the first move. So the people providing the fuels say, well, where's the demand? The people who may be users of the fuels, they will say, well, where are the fuels? And everyone says, where's the infrastructure? And that speaks for us to the need for governments, because this is in the end a coordination problem. We are not arguing that governments need to step in and impose technology solutions on the market. What we are arguing and what we are talking to governments around the world on is make sure that you have a vision of how the sequencing works well, so that when ammonia engine ships are available, that the bunkering is available, that the infrastructure is available to connect producers to those supply chains. Because these are complex supply chains, and that's come up already in many of the discussions. And they will only be as strong as the weakest part of that link. So the work that we do is very much to talk to you, to talk to governments, and to try and identify which bits are moving fast, which bits need additional impetus, and to try and correct that before it becomes an overwhelming commercial issue for the actors in this room. So the message from our side is one of dialogue, it's one of partnership. These projections will change. They will change as we see deployment trends, as we see cost trends, as we look at the actions that you are taking in the market. And we look forward very much to deepening that engagement with you all as we move towards that net zero emission system. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Gould. Could you kindly remain on stage, please?